February 1936. More than a year earlier, Keynes had told George Bernard Shaw that it would largely revolutionize the way the world thinks about economic problems. And so it did. It's a lesson. Truth should never be sacrificed to modesty. Like the Bible and Das Kapital, the general theory is often deeply obscure. And as with Marx and the Bible, this helped greatly to win converts. I'm not reaching here for paradox. If you must struggle, really struggle, to understand the book, as with the Bible, Marx, and Keynes, you feel a commitment to the conclusions. After so much pain, the light. And, as again with the Bible and Marx, there were enough contradictions, enough ambiguities, so that the discriminating reader could very often find just what he wanted to believe. Ambiguity, too, wins disciples.
The basic conclusion, however, was simple and unambiguous. Previously, it had been held that the economic system found its equilibrium at full employment. Idle men and idle plant were an aberration, a temporary failing. Keynes held that the modern economy could as well find its equilibrium with unemployment. The underemployment equilibrium results from businessmen and individuals seeking to save more than they invest or spend. Unemployment results when business firms do not invest and employ workers, save without spending instead. Now comes the remedy. Have the government borrow and buy from business firms, in effect with newly created money. Have it borrow and employ workers and give them welfare and unemployment benefits. And go back to work. The underemployment equilibrium is broken. The book accomplished what advocacy of the practical program had not. It won belief, recruited disciples, and it changed government policy.
I read the general theory in the summer of 1936, and to this day, I remember the shock. All I had been taught to believe and was teaching others to believe was at risk. There could be a shortage of purchasing power. Unemployment was not an aberration. In the absence of corrective action, it might be normal. To balance the budget might not be an act of wisdom. I faced up to the terrible possibility that I might have to change my mind. And for an economist, there is nothing worse.
We are fighting to save a great and precious form of government.
This was now 1936. The war was still against the Depression.
And so I accept the commission you have tendered me. I join with you. I am enlisted for the duration of the war.
Keynes's ideas were soon to be on their way to Washington, but by a rather circuitous route.
Keynes captured the United States by way of the universities, and principally by way of Harvard. In my case, at least, a bad conscience was a considerable factor. I was living as a tutor here at Winthrop House, and being an unpretentious house, Winthrop House was not anti-Irish, as were some of the more dignified places of residence. So among our inhabitants were the Kennedy brothers. And meeting them here and becoming friends, I must say, had a considerable effect on my later life. It was a lovely and tranquil world, and the only problem was that things were so terrible just outside of the university walls.
The effect of the Depression was wonderfully uneven. You had a fixed income, good investments, or a Harvard paycheck, you got richer as prices went down. A new car cost you only a few $100s. If you were poor, you couldn't even afford to ride the streetcars. One of the most imaginative of the New Deal efforts, very radical in those days, was the Farmers' Home Administration, a rescue and relief mission to the rural poor. It took pictures of its clients. In the United States, the social memory for the next 40 years would be of the Great Depression. Perhaps escape from depression meant some kind of economic revolution. We talked of this at Winthrop House.
But Keynes was a solution without a revolution. Our present world would remain, the unemployment and the suffering would go. I must say, it seemed a miracle. In 1936, after the publication of the general theory, we met several times a week to discuss this wonderful thing. It was the young who were influenced. Economists, among other things, are economical of their ideas. They tend to make those that they acquired as graduate students or put into their first book do for a lifetime. The great men of that time read and reviewed Keynes and found him wrong. They then carried their belief in balanced budgets and the gold standard to the grave and possibly even beyond. Change in economics is something that comes with the changing generations. From Harvard, Keynes went to Washington, in those days by train. It could have been this train. On Thursdays and Friday nights, the Federal Express would be half filled with Harvard faculty members, old and young, all on the way to impart wisdom to the New Deal. The Harvard Crimson once said the lectures of a noted professor of government were what he gave while catching the train to Washington. Increasingly, as the decade passed, the wisdom that we sought to impart was that of John Maynard Keynes. The Washington atmosphere initially was rather frigid. To spend public money to create jobs seemed profligate. To urge a budget deficit as a good thing seemed to many people insane. The men of sound judgment were appalled, and even your friends were cautious in the presence of such heresy.
Where did one look for allies, support for the Keynesian heresy in Washington in the Depression years? It was above all to the Federal Reserve System, a central bank of all places, symbol of the stoutest conservatism. Its boardroom, even today, is not considered a gathering place for dangerous radicals.
Things, however, were somewhat different at that time. The head of the central bank, the head of the Federal Reserve in those days, was Mariner Eccles. He was a Utah banker of highly original mind. Eccles had seen the lines of depositors form outside his own banks to get their money, and he'd seen the bankrupt farmers outside the town, and ideas very similar to those of Keynes had passed through his mind. His principal assistant was Lachlan Curry. Curry was a former Harvard faculty member who had published a book that anticipated some of the very important ideas of Keynes. Accordingly, he was thought very unsound, and he was not promoted. There's a lesson here, I may say. In economics, one should never be right too soon. You should wait until the parade is passing your door, and then you should step bravely out in front.
From the Federal